California is unquestionably one of the most well-known states in the U.S., primarily due to its robust economy, which ranks first among other states and even surpasses many nations by various measures. However, erosion is a seriously detrimental process that affects the state. California is losing its coastline due to coastal erosion. Excessive and careless farming is causing land to be lost on a regular basis, and the most concerning aspect is that hill erosion is simply accepted in the state because wildfires are common in California, which burn away all the vegetation, and then large sections of hills suddenly collapse, killing people and wreaking havoc. You know what really helps combat this dangerous kind of erosion? Tons of dead vegetation. Let's see how it works. You've probably heard a lot about the problems in the southwestern states. Locals are aware that when it rains, problems are likely to arise because it frequently results in a large volume of water pouring quickly. For instance, between December 31, 2022 and March 25, 2023, there was so much rain in a short period of time that, even though the damage wasn't catastrophic in scope, it's nearly impossible to accurately estimate all of it because there was just too much of it. The saddest part of the entire situation is that, as they say, things used to be better. California ended up with 22 fatalities, at least 200,000 homes without power, and 6,000 people ordered to evacuate. It's important to note that things are only going to get worse because climatologists predict that droughts will continue to lengthen and rain will fall more forcefully. Researchers have determined that California has entered an era of droughts marked by longer gaps between rainfall, meaning that more water is now falling over shorter periods than before. In addition to floods, California is currently experiencing a lot of wildfires. It's likely that everyone has heard about the terrible events that occurred in January 2025 when a catastrophic fire devastated the greater Los Angeles area and its surrounding regions, destroying over 10,000 structures, forcing 180,000 people to evacuate and causing an enormous amount of damage. Even though it cost $250 billion, it wasn't the only fire to hit California since 2000. Since then, the state has witnessed yearly fires that have burnt anything from 89,000 acres or 9% to 1 or 6 million acres, 6% of the entire geographical area of the state, yet those figures are not the highest. For instance, more than 8,100 flames blazed through more than 4 areas during the 2020 wildfire season alone. 4 million acres, over 350,000 Californians reside in cities entirely situated in high-risk fire zones, and 7 million individuals inhabit areas with extremely high fire hazard severity zones, which also include areas with lower risk if you exclude people. The climate is largely to blame for California's fire risk, just as it is for its frequent floods, and the situation is only getting worse due to the state's increasingly low humidity, high temperatures, lack of rain, and strong winds. And there are fires, and fires. Do you see how we're seeing floods and fires occurring in the same area? This is a major issue, particularly due to erosion. And it's even worse when it comes to hillside erosion, where the U.S. Geological Survey found a tenfold increase in following wildfires in Northern California in the late 1980s and early 2010s. Soil erosion from the hills has increased in frequency. This is obviously very harmful to everything in its path, such as roads, houses, and other infrastructure, and it can cause both human and animal casualties. It's also worth noting, the 2014 King Fire, which started in El Dorado County not far from the national park, is a prime example of how the burned soil and vegetation on the hills cause not only erosion but also floods, especially during the infrequent but intense California rains that fall and simply run down because there are no plants or topsoil to hold the water back. Nearly 99,000 acres of forest were destroyed, most of it on the hills. The Brush Creek and Slab Creek reservoirs, which are essential parts of the SMUD hydroelectric plant in the Sierra Nevada mountains, are also in danger, as was 11 Pines Road, the main route connecting Highway 50 to the northern edge of the El Dorado National Forest. Many issues were anticipated, including the possibility that sediment flowing from the hills would clog drainage pipes and degrade the water quality in streams and reservoirs. However, the U.S. Forest Service, which included soil scientists, botanists, and hydrologists, didn't wait for the California rains that would lead to adverse effects. They determined that 1,200 acres of forest required urgent care prior to the arrival of the heavy rains. After everything was determined, it was decided that it was time to rely on dead plants, or more specifically, large bales of certified rice straw free of weeds, a byproduct of rice cultivation. Loaded into horizontal shredders, which broke the straw into tiny mulch pieces, and then helicopters showed up. Since navigation is no longer an issue, there is no chance of dropping the straw somewhere it shouldn't be. Generally, all of the processed straw was placed into nets on 2 In the end, not all of the selected area could be treated, but 320 acres were still covered with yellow straw thanks to medium-sized helicopters that flew to convert formerly green forest areas on slopes that were 15 to 60% steep into areas covered with straw. As mentioned, one load of straw could cover nearly an acre of forest with a ton of straw, and each round trip took 4 minutes. You may be wondering how straw relates to this, how it prevents erosion, and how dead plants can protect us from the devastating effects of fires. The U.S. Forest Service didn't do this carelessly, so let's take a look at each plant in detail. Each plant has a vast root system that travels underground, grows there and acts. Short but intense California rains follow the fire, and the soil lacks stabilization, making it easily washed away by the water. A fire breaks out, destroying all the plants and the topsoil with its fungi, bacteria, and other organic materials that keep it in place and allow it to absorb water. It deteriorates, which can result in pieces being ripped from the hills, which then rush down and cause all the problems we discussed. Additionally, the fire may cause the soil to become crusty, which actually repels water, which causes the rain to fall on the hills and rush down as a rapid flow, causing flooding and destruction. While not as effective as a typical healthy forest soil layer, the straw mulch layer of dead plants is a simple stabilization technique that helps slow down water runoff, preventing large chunks of soil from being washed away from hillsides and acting as a shield to lessen the impact of rain on the soil, which reduces the risk of erosion. Regretfully, there are no particular performance indicators for mulching in the California fire case, but at least there haven't been any reports of damage to the roads or infrastructure that should have been protected, so it appears that they were able to avoid the negative effects after. Furthermore, data on the effectiveness of this type of mulching can be found. Let's fast forward to 2020 Spain, where researchers were calculating and studying everything on scorched lands. As a result, we now know that straw mulch laid out following a significant fire retains more moisture than the soil in areas where no straw was used. Further research demonstrates that even if 67% of the area is covered with straw, erosion decreases by 70 to 75% after a forest fire. Overall, this solution proved to be genuinely effective in preventing serious consequences from the King Fire in California. If more than 80% of the affected soil is covered with straw after the fire, erosion is reduced by up to 90%. It should be noted that straw mulching is not only a temporary solution to stop erosion, but that it can also act as a sort of booster to help a burned-out area recover. The straw blanket reduces evaporation and helps to collect and infiltrate rainwater, which is particularly helpful for California because plants require moisture during its protracted dry spells. Lacks a source, but straw slowly releases the water it is stored during the rain. Additionally, the straw will eventually begin to break down, releasing nutrients into the soil and other plants. This is also very beneficial for California's vegetation, which thrives in often unfavorable conditions though there are weeds. Straw, according to gardeners, keeps them away. This feature will also benefit the forest, particularly for the soil damaged by the fire where plants must work even harder to grow. Using mulch to prevent post-fire erosion is obviously not a Californian invention. This method has already shown itself numerous times, even during harsher fires, like the one that broke out in 2020 at Cameron Peak in Colorado, which destroyed almost 210,000 acres in the Arapjo and Roosevelt National Forests in Lamar and Jackson counties, as well as in Rocky Mountain National Park. The fire was characterized by extremely high temperatures, low humidity, rough terrain, and strong winds. With a few minor exceptions, the situation there was exactly the same as in California, and the anticipated outcomes were equally as terrifying. For instance, researchers quickly noted that the hill's forest soil would lose its top layer when rain came and washed it away, resulting in an excess of runoff and nutrients in the areas where it all ended up. The fire's perimeter included over 990 miles of the Poudre and Big Thompson rivers, putting many valuable assets connected to these waterways at serious risk. The effects were immediately apparent in the summer of 2021 when washed-out roads, unexpected floods, and mudslides on the Poudre. Everything indicated that the heavy rains in the region where everything had previously burned had caused a flow of soot ash and charred tree remnants into the river and its numerous tributaries, which is why the river itself turned black due to sediment. For instance, in July 2021, there was a flood during which several people in Lamar County were. Helicopters flew over the fire-damaged areas, spreading straw. Over 10,000 acres in the Poudre River were set aside for this, and 1,480 acres in the Big Thompson River were set aside for this, the most dangerous areas. A few buildings were also destroyed, and some residents had to evacuate to safer areas, which with the most polluting were covered with straw. It's important to note that, in addition to agricultural rice straw, shredded wood was also used for mulching. Overall, the project was viewed as a successful solution to the issue, but there was a drawback. The cost of the helicopter team's single flight was very high. Cost $5,000 to $6,000 for two. The anticipated cost of mulching 10,800 acres of the fire-affected forest, including 4 acres, was $31 million when additional costs were taken into account. These barriers were also employed to control erosion during the Cameron Peak fire recovery works. They are composed of, in contrast to dropping straw from a helicopter, moving such a structure from one location to another is a laborious task. However, despite their bulky appearance, the barriers are made of straw, so the total weight isn't that heavy. They are rolled into a cylinder and wrapped in mesh to prevent them from falling apart. Because they are heavy, they are ideal for controlling erosion on hills damaged by fires. The idea is simple. The barrier is placed along the slope's contour to stop things, and then the flow is slowed down. As you may know, one of the primary issues with erosion following a fire is sediment that clogs streams. The idea that a straw barrier can allow water to pass through while blocking out everything else seems good, but recent research has revealed that the barrier isn't very effective during periods of high rainfall. In these situations, deposits from past erosion events can easily exceed or reduce the barrier's holding capacity. Since rainfall in California is the definition of intensity, construction and installation can actually exacerbate erosion by concentrating runoff at the lower end of the barrier. However, if circumstances permit, the technique can be used as demonstrated in Colorado, where straw barriers were actively set. Although logs are heavier than straw barriers, they can still be used to prevent erosion on hillside slopes. On moderately or severely burned slopes with a grade of 20 to 60% in soils that are prone to erosion, the setup is essentially the same as with straw barriers. You bring the logs to setting them up in the proper location on the slope, but the problem is that, in contrast to straw, a log can simply roll away, leaving them partially buried. Studies have indicated that logs can lessen water runoff, but again, only in light rainstorms. For example, if it's pouring. In this case, non-reproducing annual plants are typically chosen because they are specifically chosen to avoid negative interactions with the local environment. However, experts say that the impact is unlikely to be significant. Another method of preventing erosion is planting, yes, just sowing seeds to restore the surface that was scorched. And to avoid alterations to the local biodiversity. Then, without much planning, seeds are dispersed across the burned area or trees are planted. If there is a possibility, they employ a tactic that we have already witnessed a few times today, in which airplanes and occasionally drones are used to stop post-fire erosion on hillside terrain. Slopes were used extensively in the past, particularly in the US in the 1970s and 1980s, when 75% of the burned areas treated in the states were seeded in this manner. However, this technique isn't as popular today for the following reasons. There's a chance of introducing non-native species, which could hinder the recovery of local vegetation, and only 30% of the burned areas treated in the US in the 2000s were seeded well, suggesting that straw is the most effective way to prevent erosion and flooding. Research on seeding burned areas has revealed that seed survival rates in the first year following a fire are low, and plants simply did not survive long enough to become an effective defense against erosion and flooding. Efficient technique of the ones listed, but it's important to remember that addressing erosion on hills calls for a multifaceted strategy because of the dangers posed by slopes that have been burned clear of vegetation, are just too intricate to handle with a one remedy for the slope's threat, whose coverings have burned away is too many